The lawyer's voice didn't tremble, but the air in the study shattered as if he'd thrown a brick through a stained glass window. $2.5 million, he repeated, the syllables landing like lead weights on the Persian rug. To be held in a private trust for the sole benefit of Martha Jenkins. The silence that followed was visceral, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The matriarch's knuckles turned a ghostly white as she gripped the silver head of her cane, her frame stiffening into a statue of cold, aristocratic fury. Beside her, the socialite let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat, her mouth agape in a silent scream of indignation. The heir apparent simply stared, his youthful face a mask of fractured glass, unable to process how the woman who had scrubbed his floors since he was in diapers was now his superior in wealth. Martha stood by the sideboard, the silver tea tray still heavy in her hands. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging, tracking through the thin layer of powder on her cheek. She looked up at the oil painting of Anthony Murray, whose stern eyes seemed to twinkle with a final, posthumous rebellion. She was no longer just a shadow in a Navy uniform. She was the architect of their ruin. The nobody they had ignored for 30 years had just inherited the keys to their kingdom. And as the matriarch's eyes locked onto hers with murderous intent, Martha realized the war for her life had only just begun. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound that dared to fill the Murray mansion in the hours before the end. For 30 years, Martha Jenkins had moved through these corridors like a ghost, a silent fixture of the estate who knew the exact degree of heat required for Anthony's morning tea and the precise way he liked his pillows propped to ease his failing lungs. She had perfected the art of the soft footfall, ensuring that her presence was felt only through the comfort she provided, never by the space she occupied. To the rest of the family, she was Cynthia B., a name the matriarch had assigned her decades ago because it was easier to remember than her own. But to the man dying in the master suite, she was the only person left who didn't look at him like a ledger to be settled. The night of ash, as the staff would later whisper, began with a sudden, suffocating stillness. Outside, a late winter frost had turned the gardens into a jagged landscape of silver and gray, but inside the bedroom, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint, lingering aroma of the expensive cigars Anthony hadn't been allowed to smoke for years. Martha sat by the bedside, her navy uniform pressed and crisp even at 3 in the morning. She didn't reach for his hand until he gestured, a weak, trembling movement of his fingers. When he spoke, his voice was a rasping ghost of the command that had once made the 5 boroughs tremble. He didn't talk of territory or the business that had built the walls of this fortress. Instead, he spoke of a small house in the south, of the sound of cicadas, and of the debt he owed to the woman who had watched him become a monster and stayed to watch him become a man again. He pressed a small, leather-bound book into her palms, his eyes burning with a lucidity that terrified her. "They think I'm leaving them a kingdom, Martha?" he whispered, a final, jagged cough racking his chest. "But I'm leaving them exactly what they deserve. And I'm giving you the life they tried to take from me." By dawn, the room was full of weeping heirs and calculated glances at the safe behind the desk. But Martha had already retreated to the kitchen. She polished the silver with a steady hand, her face a mask of grief-stricken stone. She was back to being the invisible shadow, the domestic worker in the background of their tragedy. They didn't notice the way she gripped the edge of the counter to keep her hands from shaking, or the fire beginning to kindle in her eyes. The lion was gone, and he had left the keys to the cage in the hands of the woman they had spent a lifetime looking past. The heavy silence of the study was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic tap of the matriarch's cane against the hardwood floor. It was a predatory sound, measuring the distance between her fury and the woman standing by the sideboard. The lawyer, a man who had spent 40 years navigating the treacherous currents of the Murray family, carefully adjusted his spectacles, his eyes refusing to meet any member of the biological family. "I believe the language is quite clear," the lawyer murmured, his voice cutting through the thick, mahogany-scented air. The $2.5 million is not a suggestion. It is a directive executed by Anthony R. Murray 3 months before his passing. It is immediate, irrevocable, and independent of the rest of the estate. The socialite let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, her fur coat sliding off her shoulders as she slumped into a velvet chair. A maid? 20 years of being a daughter, and I am surpassed by the help? She hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and indignant rage. Behind her, the heir apparent paced like a caged animal, his sharp gray suit reflecting the cold light of the overcast afternoon. He didn't look at his sister. His eyes were fixed on the document in the lawyer's hand as if he could incinerate it with a glance. Then the matriarch moved. She rose from her seat with a slow, terrifying grace, her pearls clinking against her black dress. She didn't look at the lawyer. She walked straight toward Martha, stopping just inches away. Up close, the older woman smelled of lavender and cold iron. She leaned on her cane, her face a mask of thinly veiled fury. "You think you've won, Cynthia?" the matriarch whispered, her voice a low, dangerous rasp that didn't carry to the rest of the room. "You think because he grew soft in his final hours, because he mistook your service for something more, that you are one of us?" Martha didn't lower her head this time. The habit of 30 years tugged at her spine, urging her to look at the floor, to vanish into the wallpaper, but the weight of the document in her hand felt like an anchor. "My name is Martha," she said, her voice small but steady. The matriarch's eyes narrowed, a flash of pure, murderous hatred crossing her features. She leaned in closer, the silver head of her cane digging into the rug. "Listen to me very carefully. You will not touch a cent of that money. You will sign the waiver my attorneys have prepared, or you will find that this house and this city can become a very small, very dark place for a woman of your standing. You'll never see a dollar. I will burn this entire legacy to the ground before I let a servant take what belongs to my blood." She turned her back on Martha, the declaration hanging in the air like a death sentence. The war had been declared, and as the heirs closed ranks around their matriarch, the invisible woman in the Navy uniform realized that the mansion had officially transformed from a place of service into a battlefield. The iron gates of the Murray estate didn't just swing shut. They sealed with a heavy, final thud that echoed across the manicured lawns. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside the mansion had shifted from somber mourning to a calculated, high-stakes siege. Martha stood in the center of the grand kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her usual polishing cloth, only to find the heir apparent leaning against the industrial refrigerator, his arms crossed over his sharp gray suit. He didn't speak. He simply watched her with a look of pure disbelief and suspicion, as if waiting for her to pull a wiretap or a stolen ledger from her apron pocket. The golden cage had been activated. The matriarch had issued a silent decree. Martha was not to leave the grounds, and she was never to be left alone. Every time Martha moved from the pantry to the dining hall, the click of the socialite's designer heels followed a few paces behind. They no longer saw her as the woman who had held Anthony's hand as he took his final breath. They saw her as a plant, a sophisticated grifter who had spent 30 years playing the long con to dismantle their dynasty from the inside. "Where is the rest of it, Martha?" the socialite asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she cornered Martha in the laundry room. She toyed with a heavy diamond ring, her eyes scanning the small, windowless space for any sign of hidden documents. "A man like my father doesn't just leave a random sum like that. There's a second will, isn't there? Or perhaps a set of keys to the offshore accounts he kept from us. You've been his little pet for so long. Surely you know where he hid the real blood money." Martha squeezed the warm fabric of a folded towel, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Sterling. I only know what the lawyer read." A sharp laugh erupted from the doorway where the matriarch stood, leaning heavily on her cane. The old woman looked at Martha not with the disdain of a mistress for a servant, but with the focused intensity of a predator assessing a rival. "She's good," the matriarch murmured, her eyes cold and clinical. "She's been living in our shadows for 3 decades, listening at doors, watching the envelopes change hands. She's not just a maid. She's a vault." The family began to treat the house like a prison camp. The Wi-Fi password was changed, the landlines were monitored, and the security detail at the perimeter was doubled. Martha was trapped in the very halls she had spent a lifetime cleaning, surrounded by fur coats and sharp suits that felt more like shark fins circling a lone swimmer. They poked at her life, searching for a crack, convinced that the shy woman they had ignored was actually the greatest threat the Murray Empire had ever faced. But as she lay in her small servants' quarters that night, listening to the muffled arguments of the heirs in the hallway, Martha reached under her mattress and felt the cold, hard edges of the leather-bound book Anthony had given her. They thought she was a spy for an enemy, but they had yet to realize she was the only one who truly knew the enemy was already inside the house. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck midnight, the heavy tolls vibrating through the floorboards like a warning. Inside the dark study, the air was thick with the scent of mahogany and the lingering ghost of Anthony's tobacco. Martha moved with the practiced silence of a woman who had spent 3 decades navigating the shadows of this house. She didn't turn on the lamps. The moon, slicing through the heavy velvet curtains, provided just enough light to illuminate the dust motes dancing over the empty leather armchair. She knelt by the bottom shelf of the massive oak bookcase, her fingers tracing the spines until she found it. A weathered, leather-bound volume of Virgil's poetry that Anthony had reached for whenever the weight of his empire seemed too heavy to bear. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled the book from its slot. As she opened it, a single cream-colored envelope slid out and landed on the Persian rug. Her name, her real name Martha, was written across the front in Anthony's jagged, forceful script. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal. "To the only woman who never asked me for a favor," the letter began. The words seemed to pulse on the page. "Martha, if you are reading this, the vultures are already circling. My family looks at you and sees a servant, but I looked at you and saw the only shred of humanity left in this fortress. They think I left you that money out of guilt. They're wrong. I left it to you because you are the only one with the heart to use it for good, and the only one smart enough to keep them from burning everything I built to the ground." The letter went on to detail a side of Anthony his children never knew. His regret over the lives he had dismantled and his secret hope that Martha would be the one to break the cycle of violence. But the final paragraph made the breath catch in her throat. "Check the back of the book, Martha. There is a reason the matriarch is so desperate to keep you here. It isn't just the 2 million. It's the truth about what happened on the night of Ash." As she felt the hollowed-out space in the back of the book's binding, her fingers brushed against a small, cold metal key and a list of digital access codes. This wasn't just a letter of gratitude. It was a roadmap to the Murray family's darkest secrets. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Martha froze, clutching the letter to her chest as a thin sliver of light appeared under the study door. The golden cage was narrowing, and the invisible woman had just found the weapon that could either set her free or ensure she never left the estate alive. The velvet silence of the upper gallery was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of the socialite's heels, a sound like a countdown toward a confrontation Martha could no longer avoid. Martha was polishing the banister, the same mahogany rail she had wiped down 1,000 times, when a hand adorned with rings worth more than Martha's hometown appeared on the wood. The socialite leaned in, her fur coat smelling of expensive lilies and desperation. "Let's drop the act, Martha," she whispered, her voice a jagged mixture of honey and broken glass. "We both know you're a practical woman. You've spent your life folding our laundry and clearing our plates. You don't want a war with us. You want out." She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a check, sliding it across the polished railing. $500,000. Right now. You sign the waiver, you walk out those gates, and you never look back. It's more than you'd make in 3 lifetimes of scrubbing floors. Martha looked at the check, then up at the woman who had spent 30 years treating her like a piece of the furniture. The socialite's mouth was slightly agape, her expression one of stunned indignation that Martha hadn't immediately snatched the paper. For the first time, Martha felt the weight of the key in her pocket and the heat of the fiery pride Anthony had seen in her. Mr. Murray didn't give me that money so I could be bought off by the people who made him miserable, Martha said, her voice rising from the depths of her chest, steady and resonant. The socialite's face contorted, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the cold, predatory nature of the Murray bloodline. She snatched the check back, her heavy jewelry clashing as she stepped into Martha's personal space. You think you're special? You're a domestic in a Navy uniform who got lucky because an old man went soft in the head. If you don't take the money, we will make sure the police find Anthony's missing medication in your quarters. We will ruin you, Martha. We will put you in a cell so small you'll forget what the sun looks like. Martha didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her expression shifting from shock to a mix of grief and overwhelming relief. She realized then that they were the ones who were afraid. You can threaten me all you like, Martha replied, her eyes flashing with a light the socialite didn't recognize. But you're forgetting one thing. I've spent 30 years being invisible in this house. I've seen everything you've tried to hide. If I go down, I'm taking the Murray name with me. The socialite recoiled as if she'd been slapped, her indignant protest dying in her throat as she realized the shy maid was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly how much power she held. The velvet-lined walls of the Murray mansion had always felt like a fortress, but as Martha moved through the shadows of the second-floor landing, she realized the stone was crumbling from within. The air in the house had turned brittle, charged with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with survival. Passing the matriarch's private sitting room, Martha paused, her breath hitching as the sound of a heated, low-pitched argument bled through the heavy oak doors. The interest is doubling every 48 hours, Mother. The heir apparent's voice hissed, stripped of its usual arrogance and replaced by a raw, jagged edge of terror. The Russos aren't interested in our family history or our prestige. They want the liquid capital Anthony promised them for the waterfront deal. If we don't settle the principal by Friday, they won't just take the docks. They'll take our heads. Martha leaned closer, the silver tray in her hands vibrating with the pounding of her heart. She heard the sharp, desperate clink of ice against glass. We have the holdings, the socialite whimpered, her voice sounding small and hollow. The real estate in Jersey, the art collection. It's all tied up in probate, you fool, the matriarch snapped, her cane striking the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Anthony knew exactly what he was doing. He locked the trust accounts. He knew we were overextended with the Triad syndicates, and he knew that without his personal signature, the banks wouldn't move a dime. That Maid is sitting on the only $2.5 million of liquid cash left in the Murray name. That gift wasn't just a reward for her service. It was a ransom for our lives. The realization hit Martha with the force of a physical blow. The Murray family, the titans who had looked down on her for 30 years, were broke. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning. Anthony hadn't just left her a fortune. He had given her the only life raft in a sinking empire. The unadulterated panic she had seen in the manager's eyes on the night of the funeral wasn't about the silver or the service. It was the smell of blood in the water. She retreated silently into the darkness of the hallway, her mind racing. The family didn't just want the money to maintain their fur coats and heavy jewelry. They needed it to pay off a death debt to the underworld's most ruthless players. As she gripped the hidden key in her pocket, the power dynamic of the house shifted forever. The invisible woman was no longer just a servant or a beneficiary. She was the only thing standing between the Murray heirs and a shallow grave. Martha Jenkins, the woman who had spent a lifetime serving their needs, now held their very existence in the palm of her hand. The tension in the library was a living thing, a cold, suffocating weight that seemed to dim the light of the crystal chandelier. The matriarch stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp and skeletal against the dying embers, while the heir apparent paced the perimeter like a wolf sensing a trap. They had summoned Martha here for one final interrogation, certain that the threat of the Russos would finally break her. "The clock is ticking, Martha," the matriarch said, her voice like the grating of stone. "The men coming for this family don't care about your tears or your 30 years of service. They want the 2.5 million. Give it to us, and we might let you walk out of here alive." Martha stood her ground, her fingers curled around the small metal key in her apron pocket. The grief that had clouded her eyes for days had burned away, replaced by a clarity that made the socialite recoil. "You think this money is a gift," Martha said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant register that commanded the room. "You think Anthony was being sentimental. But he wasn't a sentimental man." She stepped toward the mahogany desk, her movements no longer those of a servant, but of a woman who held the winning hand. "He didn't leave me this money because he loved me like a daughter. He left it because I am the only person in this house who knows the truth about the Night of Ash. He left it as a life-for-a-life debt." The heir apparent stopped mid-stride, his face draining of color. "What are you talking about? 30 years ago, Anthony didn't build this empire alone," Martha whispered, the secrets of the leather-bound book fueling her words. "He built it on a betrayal that would make the Russos look like amateurs. And he kept the records, the offshore accounts, the digital ledgers, the proof of every bribe and blood payment, in a vault that requires more than just a signature." She pulled the small metal key from her pocket and held it up. The light caught the jagged teeth of the brass, casting a long, sharp shadow across the floor. "This is the master key to the Murray survival. The 2.5 million in my name is the only account that hasn't been flagged by the feds because it was filed as a domestic pension. It's the only liquid cash you have to pay your debts. But this key is the only thing that opens the digital archives that keep the triads from hunting you to the ends of the earth." The matriarch's hand trembled on her cane. For the first time in 30 years, she looked at Martha and didn't see a maid. She saw the gatekeeper. "The money isn't a gift," Martha concluded, her gaze unwavering. "It's the price of your lives. And if you want it, you're going to have to start treating me with the respect the master of this house intended." The golden afternoon light bled through the study windows, illuminating the dust motes that swirled around the oil painting of Anthony Murray. From his gilded frame, the patriarch looked down with a stern, unreadable gaze, his painted eyes seemingly fixed on the chaos unfolding beneath his feet. Martha stepped toward the fireplace, positioning herself directly beneath the mantel. She looked small against the towering portrait, a lone figure in navy and white, but the weight of the brass key in her hand made her feel anchored to the very foundations of the house. "Give it to me, Martha," the heir apparent commanded. His voice had lost its veneer of Ivy League sophistication, reduced to a desperate, jagged snarl. He reached into the waistband of his trousers and pulled a small, sleek semi-automatic. The metal glinted coldly in the sunlight. Behind him, the socialite let out a sharp, indigent gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched her brother cross a line from which there was no return. The matriarch didn't move to stop him. She stood like a gargoyle, her chin resting on the silver head of her cane, her eyes narrow and clinical. She was testing them both, the blood heir and the servant, waiting to see who would break first. Martha didn't flinch. She watched the barrel of the gun rise until it was leveled at her chest, exactly where the crest of the Murray family was embroidered on the wall behind her. The shy woman who had spent 30 years avoiding eye contact was gone. In her place stood a woman who had witnessed the true face of the lion in his final hours and realized that the cub standing before her was nothing but a shadow. "You won't pull that trigger," Martha said, her voice echoing with a terrifying, quiet confidence. "Because if you do, the code for the digital archives dies with me." And 10 minutes later, When the Russos realize they aren't getting paid, they won't care about your suit or your name. They'll burn this house to the ground with you inside it. The heir apparent's hand began to shake, the weight of the weapon suddenly too heavy for his trembling grip. He looked from Martha to the portrait of his father, then back again, realization dawning on him that he was no longer the master of this estate. Martha took a single, deliberate step forward, her gaze never wavering. She was the emotional center of the room, the only one whose expression conveyed the gravity of what was at stake. "Your father didn't leave me this money to spite you," she whispered, her voice cutting through his panic. "He left it to save you from yourselves. Now put the gun down, and let's discuss the terms of your survival." The heir apparent's hand dropped as if the weapon had suddenly turned into white-hot iron. It hit the Persian rug with a muffled thud, a sound that signaled the definitive collapse of the old Murray order. The matriarch remained frozen for a heartbeat, her gaze shifting from the gun to the woman standing beneath her husband's portrait, before she slowly exhaled, a sound like air escaping a tomb. "The papers are on the desk," Martha said, her voice echoing through the study with a newfound, quiet authority. "You will sign the agreement. I will release enough capital to satisfy the Russos and the Triads today, ensuring this house remains standing. In exchange, you will acknowledge the trust as irrevocable. You will keep your titles, your social standing, and your fur coats, but you will never again treat the staff of this estate as anything less than the people who keep you alive." The socialite was the first to move, her indignation replaced by a frantic, trembling need for survival. She snatched the fountain pen from the mahogany desk, her heavy jewelry clinking as she scrawled her name. The heir apparent followed, his face a mask of fractured pride and silent disbelief. Finally, the matriarch approached. She didn't lean as heavily on her cane this time. She walked with the stiff dignity of a defeated general. She looked at the signature line, then up at Martha, seeing the reflection of Anthony's iron while staring back at her. With a sharp, decisive stroke, the truce was sealed. As the ink dried, the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion for decades seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp, cinematic clarity. Martha walked to the heavy velvet curtains and pulled them wide, letting the afternoon sun flood the mahogany-lined study. She reached up and unpinned the small lace cap from her hair, letting the severe bun loosen. She was no longer Cynthia B., the invisible shadow who perfected the art of being a nobody. She looked at the family, the titans who were now her dependents, and felt a mix of grief for the man she had lost and an overwhelming relief for the woman she had become. She walked toward the double doors, her navy uniform no longer a symbol of subservience, but a mantle of power. The shy maid was gone forever. As she stepped out into the hallway, the estate manager and the junior staff straightened their backs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Martha Jenkins didn't just have the money. She had the keys to the kingdom. She was the first and only queen of the House of Murray, and for the first time in 30 years, she was finally home.